Hello. Today, thank you for joining us. I want to talk a little bit about politics. Terrifying. But this whole thing was precipitated, first of all, by the fact that we're in election season. We've got 2 weeks left, so maybe I'm a little bit late to the dance, but better late than never. So this summer I was listening to a podcast by Carl Trueman and Todd Pruitt called The Mortification of Spin. They have these different people on. They talk about their books and stuff like this, right? It's sort of a leader in Protestant thinking. This particular podcast, they had a guy on named Miles Smith who was talking about religion and republic. And at one point fairly early on in the podcast, he said, quote, "I'm actually someone who doesn't want the church to do politics. I think the church is, quite frankly, not competent to do politics." And neither Truman nor Pruitt challenged him on this. And I realized this is a big problem. I think this is a totally irresponsible way to think about the church and politics. I think probably a good analogy would be to say that, it would be like saying, doctors shouldn't do surgery because they're not competent to do it. Now, there's a couple problems with that. The first one is it's totally possible that doctors are just not capable of doing surgery. Maybe they're really not competent. And shame on them. They ought to get better training because somebody's got to do the surgery. The other thought is it's imagining a world that somehow would be acceptable in which the doctors really aren't doing surgery, right? But if they're not doing it, who's going to do it, right? And the reason I say this is just like the church and politics is because the church is absolutely the best equipped of anybody to do, think, talk about politics. And I want to talk about 3 things where I'm going to try to argue that, and I have 3 points today. First is, what is politics? The second is, how should we think about voting, who we're going to vote for? And the third is, how should we think about elected officials? That's another one of these. So, what is politics? Politics, the idea of it is contained in the name itself. The name comes from the polis, right? The city, the group of people, right? It doesn't have to be a city, it's a group of people. How are we going to organize the group of people? That is politics. And as soon as you say that, you realize, and as soon as you look into this at all, you realize that what you're dealing with is a question of social morality, right? What kind of morality or ethic is going to be imposed upon the group? Now, in the case of a democracy, the group that is imposing the ethical system is also the group that is being imposed upon, right? Because we vote on it. But the basic idea here is that politics is actually a field of ethics, right? It's actually kind of a small part of a field of ethics, right? Ethics could be a lot of things, right? Like biomedical ethics, personal ethics, ethics of conversations. I mean, there's just all sorts of ethical questions, right? But politics is just one of them, right? But ethics, all ethics, falls within a much bigger category, or I should say it is dependent upon a much bigger category called metaphysics, right? So metaphysics is, what is the world like at the bottom of it, right? So obviously there's a table, right, chairs, but there's something that governs the way the world works. And that is the question that metaphysics deals with. And this is an important question because as soon as you think about metaphysics, you realize that whatever the world is like at the bottom of it governs the way we should act in it, right? So this is why metaphysics is always ahead of ethics. You have to answer metaphysical questions in order to answer ethical questions. And everybody agrees on this, right? Even Friedrich Nietzsche, the great atheist philosopher of the 19th century, totally agreed with this. He said, God is dead. Therefore, everybody should just create their own ethic, right? God clearly agrees with this. The preface to the Ten Commandments is, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Therefore, you should live like this, right, in the Ten Commandments. How you live, in other words, is dependent on who I am, who God is, right? But this is sort of a basic principle of the relationship between metaphysics and ethics. If, for example, the deepest structure of the universe is literally just laws of physics, then it really doesn't matter how you live as long as you don't disobey gravity. And, gravity has a pretty good way of making sure that you don't disobey it, because it doesn't really work out for people who try to. But the same is true of metaphysics. If the deepest structure of the universe comes from God, then you have to live in a way that is in accord with God. Otherwise, you're doing something to your soul that is essentially like, trying to disobey gravity by, walking off a cliff and just hoping nothing happens to you, right? So this is why ethics is always downstream from metaphysics. And it is why if you understand metaphysics properly, then you are in the best position to talk about ethics, which is why you are in the best position to talk about politics. And it's why, properly speaking, the only people who can really do politics correctly are those people who understand metaphysics, and that is the church. Because the church has this glorious heritage from God himself, who has revealed himself to us both in acts of history and in particular in the incarnation of Christ and in the scriptures. So we are best equipped to do politics. And this is why this whole business from this guy, Miles Smith, is so completely misguided. So the church is precisely the people who should do this. Now, the question then is, okay, how do I think about politics? And of course, the immediate concern for us is, how do I think about voting? Now, the first principle here is the laws that govern you you should consider them to be given by God, in essence, anyway. And the laws that govern us are, for example, that every citizen has the right to vote. And in the Bible, if you have the right to make a decision on the future of the group, which is politics, then you have a responsibility to participate in that decision-making process, which at a very bare minimum in our nation means voting. So I think you see this in particular in the selection of Matthias to replace Judas in Acts chapter 1. All of the 11 apostles got together and they said, we've got to figure this thing out. Okay, so they figured it out. Now they did say, okay, we're going to draw lots, but they drew lots with between candidates who they had already thoroughly vetted as likely apostles. These guys would both be good for the job. We're going to let God decide who is the best of them. So Matthias wins. But in each case, in this case in particular, I think in other cases as well in the scriptures, what you see is that when you have the option to help choose the future of the group, you have to participate in it. So that's the basic guiding principle of voting and why every Christian should vote in America. Now, there is an exception to this rule, and I think probably there's exceptions to most rules, but the exception to this rule is that if your conscience will not allow you to vote for any of the candidates, then you should not disobey your conscience, because God has given you your conscience for a reason, and it's a terrible thing to disobey that. Now, the first question is, should I vote? Yes. Next question is, how should I vote? Basically, you got to remember that when you go into the polling place and you stand in that booth, you are selecting the name of a person to represent you. But that person is essentially the representative of a party. And so what you need to understand if you want to think about how, who you're going to vote for is what does a party stand for? There is a kind of another question here, that is, how likely is that candidate, how likely is it that he or she will uphold the values of the party? That's important. But the most important question is, what does the party stand for? And you can look these things up online. It's very clear. They tell you exactly what they stand for. And they're all social morality principles, because that's what politics is, right? So you look at the party platform and you say, okay, does this platform, how well does it line up with the moral law, which is what God has given us as the rubric for how to love our neighbor as ourselves. And there's a really easy way to find out what the moral law is, because you just looked at the 10 Commandments. The Bible's clear everywhere that this is the summary of the moral law. And in particular, the question of how to love your neighbor as yourself is found in what they call the second table of the law, which is the commandments that deal with how you deal with other people, right? So starting with the commandment to to honor your father and your mother, then thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, and thou shalt not covet. Okay, so how does this party line up with that? And there's fairly good ways to think about this, right? Like, so how does the party line up with the question of honoring your father and your mother? Well, the question of honoring your father and mother begins with the fact that there is a father and a mother, right? So if the party is in favor of the preservation of the family, then at the very least, this would be this would be in favor of the fifth commandment in some sort of basic sense, right? So in other words, though, if the party is against the preservation of the family, right? Like, so they want to introduce things like gay marriage. They want to introduce things like surrogate parenting, which totally disrupts the natural order of father, mother, child. Then this party is against reality, and this party is against the moral law, and that's a bad thing. Next thing, is this party in favor of killing people? Well, there are parties that are in favor of killing people. It's called abortion. Abortion is murder. So if a party is in favor of killing people, that's probably not a good idea. Is this party in favor of killing people by assisted suicide? Again, strictly forbidden in the moral law. So that goes against the sixth commandment. Is this party in favor of adultery, right? Like, so adultery, the seventh commandment, it expands, it goes way beyond just the idea of extramarital affairs, right? It goes into the whole question of preserving human sexuality as it was made, right? So is this party in favor of the transgender stuff? Is this party in favor of calling things, legalizing and also promoting things for children that would cause them to abandon sexuality as it is given by God? Well, if they're in favor of that, not a good party, right? Is this party in favor of theft, right? So the next commandment, the eighth commandment. Well, there's a good, nobody says, hey, I'm in favor of stealing. But the whole idea of thou shalt not steal also includes the concept of property rights. So is this party in favor of massive wealth distribution? Well, if it is, that's a big problem. I should add here that there is such a thing as proper, wealth distribution. The property rights described in the Bible are not absolute. You do not have an absolute right to do what you want with your property. And this is clear from the Levitical laws that prohibit people from gleaning all of the crop from their field, right? They have to leave some for the poor. They also are not allowed to use the field every seventh year so that the poor can eat, right? So there are limits to it, and that, I think, should be translated in our context into an understanding that we do have an obligation to care for the poor, right? There is a state obligation to care for the poor, but it has certain limitations. For example, the way a state cares for the poor must not infringe upon things like the fifth commandment, honor thy father and mother, which would mean the state must not care for the poor in such a way that it actually breaks up the family, right? So that it separates father, mother, child. That is improper, right? So is the state in favor of things like massive wealth distribution? If so, this is an evil party. It's against the moral law. All right, so now we've got how do you think about voting, things like that. Next question is, how do you think about elected officials? Now, this is probably the one that Christians are the most likely to really fail at, and probably because the whole tone of our era is fairly extreme at this moment. The candidates from either party and all their supporters seem to be in favor of painting the other person as the devil, and we should lock that person up and obliterate him or her from the pages of history. Not a good thing. The Bible's very clear here. Romans 13, Paul says, the emperor is appointed by God. Therefore, you have to obey and honor this emperor. So what does that mean? Paul's talking about Nero here. Nero is the emperor at the time of the writing of Romans. Nero is one of the worst emperors in history. Still, that man was appointed by God, and he is owed the honor and respect of someone who was appointed by God to rule, even if he's terrible at it. You don't have to like him. You don't have to agree with his policies, but you still have to give him the honor that is owed to the emperor. Peter says the same thing in 1 Peter chapter 2. He says, fear God, honor the emperor. this is a basic principle, and one flows from the other. If you truly respect God, then you will definitely respect the people who God has put in authority. And every person who is put in authority over the nation is put there by God. Now, in our nation, that gets sort of muddied in our thinking because the fact is that we elect that person to be there, right? So, in other words, God uses things like people going to the polls in order to put the person in there. But nevertheless, the person who winds up there is appointed by God to be there. And furthermore, the sort of substructure reason for honoring the emperor is because the emperor is, in a very real sense, supposed to be the father of the nation, right? This is true of all of those people who are above us. They are authorities, and they represent to us fathers and mothers, right? So there's a very interesting example of this in the life of David when he has the opportunity to kill Saul in a cave. But instead, he comes up to Saul, who's sleeping, and he just cuts off a little piece of his robe. Then the next day, he shows himself to Saul. He says, "Look, my father, I just cut off a piece of your robe." So he is doing a lot of things here. It's true that David actually was Saul's son-in-law, but that's not really what he's talking about. He's saying, "Father," in other words, king of the nation, you who are the father of us all in this country, I didn't kill you, because they don't have the right to. I just took a piece of your robe. But this is true of all the leaders of the country who are appointed there, appointed to their various roles. They are the fathers of the nation, and they should be treated like that. It doesn't mean you have to like their policies. It doesn't mean you have to appreciate them or even like them. It does mean you have to honor them and love them in the way that honor and love and respect is due to our parents. So those are some thoughts on politics, and hopefully they're edifying and helpful to you as you consider voting and just talking about politics and thinking about it in this particular season. Thank you very much.